purposes. And this is confession time. When I wrote this, I didn't know my parents were going to be here, but this is confession time today. I think they know this. I went to church with this guy who worked for the stadium that the Detroit Pistons played at. And so he had tickets all the time. And he would come in on a Sunday morning and he would give us tickets. He would come to, down to the student ministry, and he would give the high school kids tickets to go if there was like a matinee game, a Sunday afternoon game, he'd give us tickets. And we go to the games all the time. And because, man, I'm embarrassed to tell this now. You guys are going to judge me. So we went to these games, right? And it was fun, but the Pistons weren't always like the best. Like there was a period of time when they were really good, but then there was some time where they weren't. And so we needed some ways to like amuse ourselves at the game. And after the game, we invented this game where, like the parking lot of a stadium has lots of traffic cones and things like directing you where to go. So we invented this game where the people in the back seats of the car would roll down the windows and like hang out, lean outside the windows and try to grab traffic cones as we drove by them. The car wouldn't slow down and you'd have to grab the traffic cones and pull them into the car. And whichever person in the back seat got more traffic cones got to decide whose house we were gonna go cone. We went coning. We invented this thing, right? And so we would go to somebody's house, usually somebody in the church. We would go to somebody's house, and we'd run out of the car and take all the cones and fling them up on their roof of their house, like on their garage and on their house. So they come out and have like these traffic cones all over their roof, like no idea where these came from. And listen, that's definitely not the way traffic cones are designed to be used, just to be flung up on people's roofs. And eventually, we got in trouble for doing that, and it was discovered who it was, and we stopped playing that game. I am told that those cones got returned to the stadium. At least we gave them back to the guy at the church that worked for the stadium. So it was only borrowing, not stealing, I hope. I'm not actually sure. But listen, we've been working through the book of Daniel. We've been working through these stories in the first half of the book during our counterculture series. And today we come to this story in chapter 5. And way back in chapter 1, in the very first story we looked at, we saw that God allowed King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon to defeat Jerusalem. And when he did that, the king carried off some articles from God's temple with him. And we now know, in chapter 5, we find out that those articles from the temple included gold and silver goblets. So these cups, these ornate cups that were used to worship God in his temple were part of the plunder. And Nebuchadnezzar is no longer the king. Now in chapter 5, we have a new king. His name is Belshazzar, not to be confused with Daniel's Babylonian name, Belteshazzar, which is very similar and not confusing at all. Belshazzar, who decided to use these cups for worship, that were designed for worship in God's temple, he decides to use them for a very different purpose. Very different than the way they were supposed to be used, kind of like we did with our traffic cones. So the story starts in Daniel chapter 5, verse 1. We're going to work our way through this whole chapter today, pieces at a time. So Daniel 5, verse 1, King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, understatement, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. That's very cartoony. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There's a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So chapter 4 ended with Nebuchadnezzar returning to the throne after turning back to God and getting his sanity back. But all of a sudden, in chapter 5, we've moved on to a new king. The Bible doesn't tell us what happened to Nebuchadnezzar. We just move on. It's just a new story, a new king. And so we know from history, from archaeology and from studying history, that after King Nebuchadnezzar's death, his son, Amel-Marduk, ruled for 2 years, just 2 years. And then a king named Neriglissar ruled for 4 years. And then his son, Labashi-Marduk, ruled for just a few months. And so if you're doing the math, that's about 6.5 years after Nebuchadnezzar of other kings. And then came a king named Nabonidus. And in the historical records, Nabonidus is listed as the last king of Babylon before it's conquered by Persia. And so until recently, Belshazzar wasn't known in history. We didn't have a record of who this guy was. And people used it as a reason to question the Bible's accuracy. That the Bible made this mistake. It's an easy thing. It's just history. It's just a historical record. They should have known who was king, but they didn't, and so it must have been a mistake. Well, as things go, and more archaeology is done, we learn more things. That's kind of how science works. We learn more things as we go, and we have since learned that Belshazzar was a real person. In fact, today we have at least 37 different ancient texts that mention Belshazzar as a prominent leader in Babylon, and we now know that he was the son of Nabonidus. So Nabonidus is the king, Belshazzar is his son. Now we also know that Nabonidus spent 10 years away from the city of Babylon. We don't know exactly why, there's lots of speculation, but he ruled the empire of Babylon from a different place than the typical capital city of Babylon. So while he was away for 10 years, he appointed his son to be the co-regent, to be the co-king, to be the ruler of the city. And so it's not a mistake for the Bible to call Belshazzar king, because to the people of the city of Babylon, he absolutely was. He carried all of the authority of his father. When he's offering people the third highest position in the kingdom, that would be the place after his father and himself. So he actually can offer that. That's in his power to grant. He couldn't make them the most powerful. That's his dad, and he wasn't going to step aside for himself. But the third highest ruler in the kingdom, he can do that. And so we also know that just a few days before this story happens, the Persian king Cyrus had defeated Nabonidus. Belshazzar's father, the king, had defeated him in battle out on a battlefield about 50 miles away from this city. And so the Persian Empire is knocking on the door. The Persian Empire is threatening the Babylonian Empire actively, right in this moment. And in this moment, Belshazzar throws this huge banquet for 1,000 of his nobles. And I don't know, it's just speculation, but it seems like maybe he's trying to consolidate power, or maybe he's trying to rally the troops, or I don't know, but something like that. His father is away, and so he's trying to rally the city of Babylon to be ready. And in the middle of this party, the king decided to bring in the goblets that were from God's temple in Jerusalem and use them like red Solo cups at a party. And it's not like the king ran out of cups, right? It's not like he had this party and he just didn't bring enough cups. He chose to do this on purpose. Daniel actually points this out later in the chapter, that he chose to do this on purpose. He goes farther in his pride than Nebuchadnezzar ever went. I mean, just in the last chapter, we saw God deal with Nebuchadnezzar's pride, but Belshazzar worshipped idols while he was drinking from cups that were intended to be used to worship God. And while they drank wine from the gold and silver goblets, it says that they praised their gods of gold and silver. Their gods are made out of the same stuff that the cups were made out of, that they were drinking. And it's ironic and weird. And we saw God deal with this. We saw God deal with Nebuchadnezzar's idol worship when he made the big, weird proportioned statue, and God saved Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego from the furnace. And we saw God deal with the king's pride just one chapter before this by taking away his sanity for 7 years until he finally turned back to God for help. And Belshazzar is guilty of both of those things. He's guilty of pride and he's guilty of worshiping idols. But we've already seen these two things. He's guilty of something new. There's something new now that Belshazzar brings into the equation, and it's blasphemy. This is new in the Daniel stories. He's just as arrogant as his father Nebuchadnezzar, which, by the way, we know from history, it's not his biological father, but father is typically used also in royal lineage of like your predecessor, and so the one who went before, and so claiming that title isn't, inaccurate necessarily. It's just he's trying to claim a connection to King Nebuchadnezzar, and so his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar, but he takes this one to a new level. He expresses his superiority, not by taking pride in his own accomplishments like what Nebuchadnezzar did, but he expresses his superiority by taking things that belong to God as holy and using them in a common way. That's blasphemy. It's dishonoring God with our speech or our actions. And that's the simplest definition of it. And Belshazzar does both of those things in this story. These goblets, these cups were reserved for a specific use. They were to be used in worshiping God at the temple. They weren't to be used for drinking wine at state banquets in Babylon. And throughout the Bible, God claims certain things as holy, that they are set apart for him alone. They are set apart to be used only this way. And using something that God sets apart as holy for some other purpose was really serious. In Israel's law, it carried the death penalty. Using something that God set apart as holy was a serious sin. Numbers 15 says that blasphemy, when it's talking about what blasphemy is, it says that blasphemy is not something that happens by accident, right? Sometimes, remember in the New Testament where we're told not to blaspheme the Holy Spirit, and we don't exactly know what that means. We kind of guess at what it means, but we're always worried that, did I do it on accident? Numbers 15 says blasphemy doesn't happen on accident. That blasphemy is when we defiantly sin by saying and doing things that curse God and insult God and oppose God. And so we tend to think of things today as, blasphemy, we tend to think of things like vandalizing a church or burning a cross, that those things are blasphemy. Those are blasphemous things. But listen, churches are just buildings. Now, I'd rather nobody vandalize our church building, but churches are just buildings. Crosses are just symbols. They're not magical. They're not set apart as holy, not in the same way that the goblets are to God. God doesn't call us to do that anymore. He doesn't call us to set aside special cups for worship in his temple like he did in the Old Testament. And that's for a simple reason. It's because the New Testament says that we are the temple of God, that God's people are his temple. So God doesn't have a temple the way he did at Jerusalem. You don't have that one holy place where you're supposed to go to worship. You can worship anywhere. You can worship in this room. You can worship in your living room. You can worship outside. You can worship inside. We can worship anywhere. It's not just this one special place where we can worship. The curtain, remember, was torn in two. We have access to God wherever we are. And the Bible calls you and I God's house for worship. The place where God's presence, the place where his Holy Spirit lives. And so blasphemy today, which remember, blasphemy is abusing something that God has set apart as holy, something that God claims as his own. Blasphemy today mainly deals with people, not with special cups or some special holy object. It's people. We are the thing that God has set apart as holy. We are the thing that God claims as his own. We are the temple articles. We are the special cups. We are the thing. And so we commit the same sin as Belshazzar when we refuse to see God's image in ourselves. When we treat others, when we treat other people as anything less than God's children. That's blasphemy in a sense when we are treating other people that God has made, people who are God's children, people who have God's Spirit living inside them. When we treat them poorly, we are tiptoeing closer and closer to this sin of blasphemy. And as we see in this story, God takes this sin very seriously. He doesn't waste any time responding to Belshazzar's blasphemy. He takes these cups and God's there. God's there with his response. And his response is alarming. These fingers of this human hand like appear and start writing on the wall near the lampstand so nobody can miss it. It's not off in the shadows, right? It's right in the spotlight, and everybody can see what's happening, and the king freaked out. It described him as like his knees are knocking and he went pale and he called for the wise men of the kingdom of, I don't know when they're going to learn that these wise men are totally incompetent and they never help, but he called for the wise men again and they didn't help. They're never any help. And the queen, reminds him about Daniel, who was about 80 years old by this time, by the way. We don't always do a great job when we tell these stories to kids of tracking Daniel's age through these stories. By now, we know through how long Nebuchadnezzar ruled and when the exile was, through lots of history, we know that Daniel was in his 80s by the time of this story. And so he probably took on some sort of background role in the government after Nebuchadnezzar died. That could explain why Belshazzar doesn't think of him right away, that he was kind of maybe semi-retired or something. But he comes back, whatever the case. He comes back to interpret a message for a new king again. And here's how it goes. This starts in verse 13. So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father, the king, brought from Judah? I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I've heard that you're able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted, and those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like an ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all the kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all of this. Instead, you set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand, but you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways." Belshazzar reminds Daniel that he's a captive. Like Daniel forgot, right? Reminds him that he's a captive. He interrogates him like he's a prisoner. Even though he knew full well the role that Daniel played with King Nebuchadnezzar. And if he didn't, the queen just reminded him, remember? So this king's pride is even worse than Nebuchadnezzar's pride. As Daniel goes on to explain what's happening, he says at least Nebuchadnezzar had a basis for pride. Right? He could say, you're promoted and you're promoted, or he could say, nope, you get the death penalty, and that's what happened. But this guy isn't even the main king in all the land. His dad is the king. So Nebuchadnezzar at least had a basis for pride in his accomplishments. He had real power over people, but Belshazzar's just showing off at a party. And if God can humble a king like Nebuchadnezzar, a real king, a king with real power, imagine what he can do with a king like Belshazzar.